Hello. Hello, welcome to Everyday Storytelling. How are you doing today? We are going to be reading the Bible with my dad. We are not going to be doing the joke of the day probably for the next.
Well, we probably won't do it today. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, but we're going to be doing the synopsis. Then we are going to be reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And we have one person watching. And
Yay, one person
the
already.
first word is I. And the first one is
Hi, Mom says change your PJs, JJ. All right, so as usual, here is what I'm going to be reading from the Bible. I like to post that for you. This is Genesis chapter 39, and from the English Standard Version of the Bible. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in the house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, she has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us." He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all of the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. Now Genesis chapter 40. And my computer was being fast earlier, and now it decided to laugh at me. Genesis chapter 40, English Standard Version. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup on Pharaoh's head." Then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, "I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head." And Joseph answered and said, "This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you." On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in the Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Bum, bum, bing. All right, so now we have come to the time when we will give the synopsis. And we don't have Rebecca yet.
Synopsis time!
We don't have Rebecca with us yet, so I hope that she gets to watch this later. Kimmy, this isn't a big surprise.
I know. Sorry.
I don't know why this picture is so small now.
Oh, it's this way.
Oh, is that a scarab?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's really nice.
So what happened in the last chapter was, so they were trying to go through this really dangerous part of the ocean, and they got stuck. And, well, let's see. And so they asked Captain Nemo if they could go on a nearby island to get some meat. So he said yes, and he was like really chill with it. Like seriously. They were all surprised at how chill he was.
So that is in basically what happened yesterday in very short terms. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and get started here. We are at about 10 minutes now, so that is really good. We ought to be able to read at least 3, maybe 4 chapters at the rate we were going yesterday. Here we go. Chapter 20, A Few Days on Land. I was much impressed on touching land. Ned Land tried the soil with his feet as if to take possession of it. However, it was only 2 months before that we had become, according to Captain Nemo, passengers on board the Nautilus, but in reality prisoners of its commander. In a few minutes we were within musket shot of the coast. The whole horizon was hidden behind a beautiful curtain of forest. Rebecca says, hi guys. Enormous trees, the trunks of which attained a height of 200 feet, were tied to each other by garlands of bindweed, real natural hammocks which a light breeze rocked. These were mimosas, figs, hibiscus, and palm trees, mingled together in profusion, and under the shelter of their verdant vault grew orchids, leguminous plants, and ferns. But without noticing all these beautiful specimens of Papuan flora, the Canadian abandoned the agreeable for the useful. He discovered a cocoa tree, bent down some of the fruit, broke them, and we drank the milk and ate the nut with the satisfaction that protested against the ordinary food on the Nautilus. Excellent, said Ned Land. Exquisite, replied Consul. And I do not think, said the Canadian, that he would object to our introducing a cargo of coconuts on board. I do not think he would, but he would not taste them. So much the worse for him, said Consul. And so much the better for us, replied Ned Land. There will be more for us. One word only, Master Land, I said to the harpooner, who was beginning to ravage another coconut tree. Coconuts are good things, but before filling the canoe with them, it would be wise to reconnaissance. It's the verb for reconnaissance, however you say that, and see if the island does not produce some substance not less useful. Fresh vegetables would be welcome on board the Nautilus. Master is right, replied Consul, and I propose to reserve 3 places in our vessel, one for fruits, the other for vegetables, and the third for the venison, of which I have not yet seen the smallest specimen. Consul, we must not despair, said the Canadian. Let us continue, I returned, and lie in wait. Although the island seems uninhabited, it might still contain some individuals that would be less hard than we on the nature of game. Ho, ho, said Ned Land, moving his jaws significantly. Well, Ned, said Consul, my word, returned the Canadian, I begin to understand the charms of anthropophagy. Anthropophagy? Ned, what are you saying? You, a man-eater? I should not feel safe with you, especially as I share your cabin. I might perhaps wake one day to find myself half devoured. Friend Consul, I like you much, but not enough to eat you unnecessarily. I would not trust you, replied Consul, but enough. We must absolutely bring down some game to satisfy this cannibal, or else one of these fine mornings master will find only pieces of his servant to serve him. While we were talking thus, we were penetrating the sombre arches of the forest, and for 2 hours we surveyed it in all directions. Chance rewarded our search for edible vegetables, and one of the most useful products of the tropical zones furnished us with precious food that we missed on board. I would speak of the breadfruit tree, very abundant in the island of Gilboa, and I remark chiefly to the variety of destitute of seeds which bears in Malaya the name of rima. Ned Land knew these fruits well. He had already eaten many during his numerous voyages, and he knew how to prepare the edible substance. Moreover, the sight of them excited him, and he could contain himself no longer. Master, he said, I shall die if I do not taste a little of this breadfruit pie. Taste it, friend Ned. Taste it as you want. We are here to make experiments. Make them. It won't take long, said the Canadian, and provided with a lintel, he lighted a fire of dead wood that crackled joyously. During this time, Consul and I chose the best fruits of the breadfruit. Some had not then attained a sufficient degree of maturity, and their thick skin covered a white but rather fibrous pulp. Others, the greater number yellow and gelatinous, waited only to be picked. These fruits enclosed no kernel. Consul brought a dozen to Ned Land, who placed them on a coal fire after having cut them in thick slices, and while doing this, repeating, "You will see, master, how good this bread is. More so when one has been deprived of it so long. It is not even bread," added he, "but a delicate pastry. You have eaten none, master?" "No, Ned." "Very well, prepare yourself for a juicy thing. If you do not come for more, I am no longer the king of harpooners." After some minutes, the part of the fruits that were exposed to the fire was completely roasted. The interior looked like a white pastry, a sort of soft crumb, the flavor of which was like that of an artichoke. It must be confessed this bread was excellent, and I ate of it with great relish. "What time is it now?" asked the Canadian. 2 o'clock at least," replied Consul. "How time flies on firm ground," sighed Ned Land. "Let us be off," replied Consul. We returned through the forest and completed our collection by a raid upon the cabbage palms that we gathered from the tops of the trees, little beans that I recognized as the abrou of the Malays, and yams of superior quality. We were loaded when we reached the boat, but Ned Land did not find his provisions sufficient. Fate, however, favored us. Just as we were pushing off, he perceived several trees from 25 to 30 feet high, a series of palm trees. At last, at 5 o'clock in the evening, loaded with our riches, we quitted the shore, and half an hour after we hailed the Nautilus. No one appeared on our arrival. The enormous iron-plated cylinder seemed deserted. The provisions embarked. I descended to my chamber, and after supper slept soundly. The next day, 6th of January, nothing new on board, not a sound inside, not a sign of life. The boat rested along the edge in the same place in which we had left it. We resolved to return to the island. Remember, they're waiting for high tide because they think that it's going to be high enough to let the boat go free, the submarine. Ned Land hoped to be more fortunate man on the day before with regard to the hunt, and wished to visit another part of the forest. At dawn we set off. The boat, carried on by the waves that flowed to shore, reached the island in a few minutes. We landed, and, thinking that it was better to give in to the Canadian, we followed Ned Land, whose long limbs threatened to distance us. He wound up the coast toward the west. Then, fording some torrents, he gained the high plain that was bordered with admirable forests. Some kingfishers were rambling along the watercourse, but they would not let themselves be approached. Their circumspection proved to me that these birds knew what to expect from bipeds of our species, and I concluded that if the island was not inhabited, at least human beings occasionally frequented it. After crossing a rather large prairie, we arrived at the skirts of a little wood that was enlivened by the songs and flight of a large number of birds. "There are only birds," said Consul. "But they are edible," replied the harpooner. "I do not agree with you, friend Ned, for I see only parrots there." "Friend Consul," said Ned gravely, "the parrot is like a pheasant to those who have nothing else." And I added, "This bird, suitably prepared, is worth knife and fork." Indeed, under the thick foliage of this wood, a world of parrots were flying from branch to branch, only needing a careful education to speak the human language. For the moment they were chattering with parrots of all colors, and gave cockatoos who seemed to meditate upon some philosophical problem, whilst brilliant red lories passed like a piece of bunting carried away by the breeze, Papuans with the finest azure colors, and in all a variety of winged things most charming to behold, but few edible. However, a bird peculiar to these lands, and which has never passed the limits of the Aru and Papuan Islands, was wanting in this collection, but fortune reserved it for me before long. After passing through a moderately thick copse, we found a plain obstructed with bushes. I saw then those magnificent birds, the disposition of whose long feathers obliges them to fly against the wind. Their undulating flight, graceful aerial curves, and the shading of their colors attracted and charmed one's looks. I had no trouble in recognizing them. Birds of paradise, I exclaimed. The Malays, who carry on a great trade in these birds with the Chinese, have several means that we could not employ for taking them. Sometimes they put snares on the top of high trees that the birds of paradise prefer to frequent. Sometimes they catch them with a vicious bird lime that paralyzes their movements. They even go so far as to poison the fountains that the birds generally drink from, but we were obliged to fire at them during flight, which gave us few chances to bring them down, and indeed we vainly exhausted one half of our ammunition. About 11 o'clock in the morning, the first range of mountains that from the center of the island was traversed, and we had killed nothing. Hunger drove us on. The hunters had relied on the products of chase, and they were wrong. Happily, Consul, to his great surprise, made a double shot and secured breakfast. He brought down a white pigeon and a wood pigeon, which, cleverly plucked and suspended from a skewer, was roasted before a red fire of dead wood. While these interesting birds were cooking, Ned prepared the fruit of the bread tree. Then the wood pigeons were devoured to the bones and declared excellent. The nutmeg with which they are in the habit of stuffing their crops flavors their flesh and renders it delicious eating. Now, Ned, what do you miss now? Some four-footed game, Monsieur Aronnax. All these pigeons are only side dishes and trifles, and until I have killed an animal with cutlets, I shall not be content. Nor I, Ned, if I do not catch a bird of paradise. Let us continue hunting, replied Consul. Let us go towards the sea. We have arrived at the first declivities of the mountains, and I think we had better regain the region of forests. That was sensible advice, and we followed it. After walking for 1 hour, we had attained a forest of sago trees. Some inoffensive serpents glided away from us. The birds of paradise fled at our approach, and truly I despaired of getting near one, when Consul, who was walking in front, suddenly bent down, uttered a triumphal cry, and came back to me, bringing a magnificent specimen. Ah, bravo, Consul! Master is very good. No, my boy, you have made an excellent stroke. Take one of these living birds and carry it in your hand. If master will examine it, he will see that I have not deserved great merit. Why, Consul? Because this bird is as drunk as a quail. Drunk? Yes, sir, drunk, with the nutmegs that it devoured under the nutmeg tree, under which I found it. See, friend Ned, see the monstrous effects of intemperance. By Jove, exclaimed the Canadian, because I have drunk gin for 2 months, you must needs reproach me. However, I examined the curious bird. Consul was right. The bird, drunk with the juice, was quite powerless. It could not fly, it could hardly walk. This bird belonged to the most beautiful of the 8 species that are found in Papua and in the neighboring islands. It was the large emerald bird, the most rare kind. It measured 3 feet in length. Its head was comparatively small, its eyes placed near the opening of the beak and also small. But the shades of color were beautiful, having a yellow beak, brown feet and claws, nut-colored wings with purple tips, pale yellow at the back of the neck and head, and emerald color at the throat, chestnut on the breast and belly. Two horned downy nets rose from below the tail that prolonged the long light feathers of admirable fineness, and they completed the whole of this marvelous bird, that the natives have poetically named the bird of the sun. But if my wishes were satisfied by the possession of the bird of paradise, the Canadians were not yet. Happily, about 2 o'clock, Ned Land brought down a magnificent hog from a brood of those natives called the Beri Autang. The animal came in time for us to procure real quadruped meat, and he was well received. Ned Land was very proud of his shot. The hog, hit by the electric ball, fell stone dead. The Canadian skinned and cleaned it properly after having taken half a dozen cutlets, destined to furnish us with a grilled repast in the evening. Then the hunt was resumed, which was still more marked by Ned and Consul's exploits. Indeed, the two friends, beating the bushes, roused a herd of kangaroos that fled and bounded along all their elastic paws, but these animals did not take to flight so rapidly, but what the electric capsule could stop their course. "Ah, Professor," cried Ned Land, who was carried away by the delights of the chase, "what excellent game! And steward, too, what a supply for the Nautilus! 2, 3, 5 down! And to think that we shall eat that flesh and that the idiots on board shall not have a crumb!" I think that in the excess of his joy, the Canadian, if he had not talked so much, would have killed them all, but he contented himself with a single dozen of these interesting marsupials. These animals were small. They were a species of those kangaroo rabbits that live habitually in the hollows of trees, and whose speed is extreme, but they are moderately fat and furnish at least estimable food. We were very satisfied with the results of the hunt. Happy Ned proposed to return to this enchanting island the next day, for he wished to depopulate it of all the edible quadrupeds. But he had reckoned without his host. At 6 o'clock in the evening we had regained the shore. Our boat was moored to the usual place. The Nautilus, like a long rock, emerged from the waves 2 miles from the beach. Ned Land, without waiting, occupied himself about the important dinner business. He understood all about cooking well. The berry outang, grilled on the coals, soon scented the air with a delicious odor. Indeed, the dinner was excellent. 2 wood pigeons completed the extraordinary menu. The sago pasty, the artocarpus bread, some mangoes, half a dozen pineapples, and the liquor fermented from the coconuts overjoyed us. I even think that my worthy companion's ideas had not all the plainness desirable. "Suppose we do not return to the Nautilus this evening," said Consul. "Suppose we never return," added Ned Land. Just then a stone fell at our feet and cut short the harpooner's proposition. Chapter 21, Captain Nemo's Thunderbolt. We looked, maybe, my guess, just reading the title of this chapter, I think that Captain Nemo has transported into the Harry Potter world and has a broomstick, a thunderbolt. Who's with me? Put your comments down below if you think that's right. I think Captain Nemo transported to the Harry Potter world and purchased a broomstick, the Thunderbolt, right? Isn't that one of the broomsticks from Harry Potter? Oh, the Firebolt. I had it wrong. My bad. Okay, well, I guess we'll have to read and find out what happens. We looked at the edge of the forest without rising, my hand stopping in the action of putting it into my mouth. Ned Land's completing its office. "Stones do not fall from the sky," remarked Consul, "or they would merit the name aerolites." A second stone, carefully aimed, that made a savagery pigeon's leg fall from Consul's hand, gave still more weight to his observation. We all three arose, shouldered our guns, and were ready to reply to any attack. "Are they apes?" cried Ned Land. "Very nearly. They are savages." "To the boat," I said, hurrying to the sea. It was indeed necessary to beat a retreat, for about 20 natives, armed with bows and slings, appeared on the skirts of a copse that masked the horizon to the right, hardly 100 steps from us. Our boat was moored about 60 feet from us. The savages approached us, not running, but making hostile demonstration. Stones and arrows fell thickly. Ned Land had not wished to leave his provisions, and, in spite of his imminent danger, his pig on one side and kangaroos on the other, he went tolerably fast. In 2 minutes we were on the shore. To load the boat with provisions and arms, to push it out to sea, and ship the oars was the work of an instant. We had not gone 2 cable lengths when the 100 savages, howling and gesticulating, entered the water up to their waists. I watched to see if their apparition would attract some men from the Nautilus onto the platform, but no, the enormous machine lying off was absolutely deserted. 20 minutes later, we were on board. The panels were open. After making the boat fast, we entered into the interior of the Nautilus. I descended to the drawing room, from whence I heard some chords. Captain Nemo was there, bending over his organ, and plunged in a musical ecstasy. Captain! He did not hear me. Captain! I said, touching his hand. He shuddered, and, turning around, said, Ah! It is you, Professor. Well, have you had a good hunt? Have you botanized successfully? Yes, Captain, but we have unfortunately brought a troop of bipeds whose vicinity troubles me. What bipeds? Savages. Savages, he echoed ironically. So you are astonished, Professor, at having set foot on a strange land and finding savages? Savages? Where are there not any? Besides, are they worse than others, these whom you call savages? But, Captain, how many have you counted? 100 at least. Monsieur Aronnax, replied Captain Nemo, placing his finger on the organ stops. When all the natives of Papua are assembled on this shore, the Nautilus will have nothing to fear from their attacks. The captain's fingers were then running over the keys of the instrument, and I remarked that he touched only the black keys, which gave his melodies an essentially Scotch character. Soon he had forgotten my presence, and had plunged into a reverie that I did not disturb. I went up again on to the platform. Night had already fallen, for in this low latitude the sun sets rapidly and without twilight. I could only see the island indistinctly, but the numerous fires lighted on the beach, showing that the natives did not think of leaving it. I was alone for several hours, sometimes thinking of the natives, but without any dread of them, for the imperturbable confidence of the captain was catching, sometimes forgetting them to admire the splendors of the night in the tropics. My remembrance went to France in the train of those zodiacal stars that would shine in some hours' time. The moon shone in the midst of the constellations of the zenith. The night slipped away without any mischance, the islanders frightened no doubt at the sight of a monster aground in the bay. The panels were open and would have offered an easy access to the interior of the Nautilus. 6 o'clock in the morning on the 8th of January, I went up onto the platform. The dawn was breaking. The island soon showed itself through the dissipating fogs, first the shore, then the summits. The natives were there, more numerous than on the day before, 500 or 600 perhaps. Some of them, profiting by the low water, had come on to the coral at less than 2 cable lengths from the Nautilus. I distinguished them easily. They were true Papuans, with athletic figures, men of good race, large high foreheads, large but not broad, and flat and white teeth. Their woolly hair, with a reddish tinge, showed off on their black shining bodies like those of the Nubians. From the lobes of their ears, cut and distended, hung chaplets of bones. Most of these savages were naked. Amongst them I remarked some women dressed from the hips to the knees in quite a crinoline of herbs that sustained a vegetable waistband. Some chiefs had ornamented their necks with a crescent and collars of glass beads, red and white. Nearly all were armed with bows and arrows, shields, and carried on their shoulders a sort of net containing those round stones which they had cast from their slings with great skill. One of these chiefs, rather near to the Nautilus, examined it attentively. He was perhaps some Mado of high rank, for he was draped in a mat of banana leaves notched round the edges and set off with brilliant colors. I could easily have knocked down this native, who was within a short length, but I thought that it was better to wait for real hostile demonstrations. Between Europeans and savages, it is proper for the Europeans to parry sharply, not to attack. During low water, the natives roamed. I guess that's the what's it called in Star Trek? All right, sorry. the the number one rule that they have. I can't remember what it's called. Prime directive. Yep, that's the prime directive. Parry sharply, don't attack. During low water, the natives roamed about near the Nautilus, but were not troublesome. I heard them frequently repeat the word "Assez," and by their gestures I understood that they invited me to go on land, an invitation that I declined. So that on that day the boat did not push off, to the great displeasure of Master Land, who could not complete his provisions. This adroit Canadian employed his time in preparing the viands and meat that he had brought off the island. As for the savages, they returned to the shore about 11 o'clock in the morning, as soon as the coral tops began to disappear under the rising tide. But I saw their numbers had increased considerably on the shore. Probably they came from the neighboring islands, or very likely from Papua. However, I had not seen a single native canoe. Having nothing better to do, I thought of dragging these beautiful, limpid waters, under which I saw profusion of shells, zoophytes, and marine plants. Moreover, it was the last day that the Nautilus would pass in these parts, if it float in the open sea the next day, according to Captain Nemo's promise. I therefore called Consul, who brought me a little light drag, very like those for the oyster fishery. Now to work. For 2 hours we fished unceasingly, but without bringing up any rarities. The drag was filled with Midas ears, harps, malames, and particularly the most beautiful hammers I'd ever seen. We also brought up some sea slugs, pearl oysters, and a dozen little turtles that were reserved for the pantry on board. But just when I expected it least, I put my hand on a wonder. I might say a natural deformity very rarely met with. Consul was just dragging, and his net came up filled with divers ordinary shells, when all at once he saw me plunge my arm quickly into the net and draw out a shell, and heard me utter a cry. "What is the matter, sir?" he asked in surprise. "Has master been bitten?" "No, my boy, but I would willingly have given a finger for this discovery." "What discovery?" "A shell," I said, holding up the object of my triumph. "It is simply an olive, porphyry, genus olive, order of the something in Latin, Pectinibranchidae, class of gastropods, subclass Mollusca." "Yes, Consul, but instead of being rolled from right to left, this olive turns from left to right." "Is it possible?" "Yes, my boy, it is a left shell." Shells are all right-handed, with rare exceptions, and when by chance their spiral is left, amateurs are ready to pay their weight in gold. Consul and I were absorbed in the contemplation of our treasure, and I was promising myself to enrich the museum with it, when a stone unfortunately thrown by a native struck against and broke the precious object in Consul's hand. I uttered a cry of despair. Consul took up his gun and aimed at a savage who was poising his sling at 10 yards behind him. I would have stopped him, but his blow took effect and broke the bracelet of amulets which encircled the arm of the savage. "Consul!" cried I. "Consul!" "Well, sir, do you not see that the cannibal has commenced the attack?" "A shell is not worth the life of a man," said I. "Ah, the scoundrel!" said Consul. "I would rather he had broken my shoulder." Consul was in earnest, but I was not of his opinion. However, the situation had changed some minutes before, and we had not perceived. A score of canoes surrounded the Nautilus. These canoes, scooped out of the trunk of a tree, long, narrow, well adapted for speed, were balanced by means of a long bamboo pole which floated on the water. They were managed by skillful, half-naked paddlers, and I watched their advance with some uneasiness. It was evident that these Papuans had already had dealings with the Europeans and knew their ships. But this long iron cylinder, anchored in the bay without masts or chimneys, what could they think of it? Nothing good, for at first they kept at a respectful distance. However, seeing it motionless, by degrees they took courage and sought to familiarize themselves with it. Now this familiarity was precisely what it was necessary to avoid. Our arms, which were noiseless, could only produce a moderate effect on the savages, who had little respect for aught but blustering things. The thunderbolt, without the reverberations of thunder, would frighten man but little, though the danger lies in the lightning, not in the noise. At this moment the canoes approached the Nautilus, and a shower of arrows alighted on her. I went down to the salon, but found no one there. I ventured to knock at the door that opened into the captain's room. "Come in," was the answer. I entered and found Captain Nemo deep in algebraical calculations of x and other quantities. "I am disturbing you," I said, for courtesy's sake. "That is true, Monsieur Aronnax," replied the captain, "but I think you have a serious reason for wishing to see me." "Very grave ones. The natives are surrounding us in their canoes, and in a few minutes we shall certainly be attacked by many hundreds of savages." "Ah," said Captain Nemo quietly, "they are come with their canoes?" "Yes, sir." "Well, sir, we must close the hatches." "Exactly, and I came to say to you, nothing can be more simple," said Captain Nemo, and pressing an electric button, he transmitted an order to the ship's crew. "It is all done, sir," said he, after some moments. "The pinnace is ready and the hatches are closed. You do not fear, I imagine, that these gentlemen could stave in walls on which the balls of your frigate had no effect?" "No, Captain, but a danger still exists." "What is that, sir?" "It is that tomorrow, at about this hour, we must open the hatches to renew the air of the Nautilus. Now, if, at this moment, the Papuans should occupy the platform, I do not see how you could prevent them from entering." "Then, sir, you suppose that they will board us?" "I am certain of it." "Well, sir, then let them come. I see no reason for hindering them. After all, these Papuans are poor creatures, and I am unwilling that my visit to the island should cost the life of a single one of these wretches." Upon that I was going away, but Captain Nemo detained me and asked me to sit down by him. He questioned me with interest about our excursions on shore and our hunting, and seemed not to understand the cravings for meat that possessed the Canadian. Then the conversation turned on various subjects, and without being more communicative, Captain Nemo showed himself more amiable. Amongst other things, we happened to speak of the situation of the Nautilus, run aground in exactly the same spot in this strait where Dumont d'Urville was nearly lost. Apropos of this d'Urville was one of your great sailors," said the captain to me, "one of your most intelligent navigators. He is the Captain Cook of you Frenchmen. Unfortunate man of science, after having braved the icebergs of the South Pole, the coral reefs of Oceania, the cannibals of the Pacific, to perish miserably in a railway train. If this energetic man could have reflected during the last moments of his life, what must have been uppermost in his last thoughts, do you suppose?" So speaking, Captain Nemo seemed moved, and his emotion gave me a better opinion of him. Then, chart in hand, we reviewed the travels of the French navigator, his voyages of circumnavigation, his double detention at the South Pole, which led to the discovery of Adelaide and Louis Philippe, and fixing the hydrographical bearings of the principal islands of Oceania. "That which your d'Urville has done on the surface of the seas," said Captain Nemo, "that have I done under them, and more easily, more completely than he. The Astrolabe and the Zélé, incessantly tossed about by the hurricane, could not be worth the Nautilus, quiet repository of labor that she is, truly motionless in the midst of the waters. Tomorrow," added the captain, rising, "tomorrow, at 20 minutes to 3 p.m., the Nautilus shall float, and leave the Straits of Torres uninjured." Having curtly pronounced these words, Captain Nemo bowed slightly. This was to dismiss me, and I went back to my room. There I found Conseil, who wished to know the result of my interview with the captain. "My boy," I said, "when I feigned to believe that his Nautilus was threatened by the natives of Papua, the captain answered me very sarcastically, 'I have but one thing to say to you. Have confidence in him and go to sleep in peace.' Have you no need of my services, sir? No, my friend. What is Ned Land doing? If you will excuse me, sir, answered Consul, friend Ned is busy making a kangaroo pie, which will be a marvel. I remained alone and went to bed, but slept indifferently. I heard the noise of the savages who stamped on the platform, uttering deafening cries. The night passed thus, without disturbing the ordinary repose of the crew. The presence of these cannibals affected them no more than the soldiers of the masked battery care for the ants that crawl over its front. At 6 in the morning I rose. The hatches had not been opened. The inner air was not renewed, but the reservoirs, filled ready for any emergency, were now resorted to and discharged several cubic feet of oxygen into the exhausted atmosphere of the Nautilus. I worked in my room till noon without having seen Captain Nemo even for an instant. On board, no preparations for departure were visible. I waited till still some time, then went into the large salon. The clock marked 2:30. In 10 minutes it would be high tide, and if Captain Nemo had not made a rash promise, the Nautilus would be immediately detached. If not, many months would pass ere she could leave her bed of coral. However, some warning vibrations began to be felt in the vessel. I heard the keel grating against the rough calcareous bottom of the coral reef. At 5:20 to 3, Captain Nemo appeared in the salon. "We are going to start," said he. "Ah," I replied, "I have given the order to open the hatches." "And the Papuans?" "The Papuans?" answered Captain Nemo, slightly shrugging his shoulders. "Will they not come inside the Nautilus?" "How?" "Only by leaping over the hatches you have opened." "Monsieur Aronnax," quietly answered the Captain Nemo, "they will not enter the hatches of the Nautilus in that way, even if they were open." I looked at the captain. "You do not understand?" said he. "Hardly." "Well, come, and you will see." I directed my steps toward the central staircase. There Ned Land and Consul were slyly watching some of the ship's crew, who were opening the hatches, while cries of rage and fearful vociferations resounded outside. The port lids were pulled down outside. 20 horrible faces appeared, but the first native, who placed his hands on the stair rail, struck from behind by some invisible force, I know not what, fled, uttering the most fearful cries and making the wildest contortions. 10 of his companions followed him. They met with the same fate. Consul was in ecstasy. Ned Land, carried away by his violent instincts, rushed on to the staircase, but the moment he seized the rail with both hands, he, in his turn, was overthrown. "I am struck by a thunderbolt!" cried he, with an oath. This explained all. It was no rail, but a metallic cable charged with electricity from the deck, communicating with the platform. Whoever touched it felt a powerful shock, and this shock would have been mortal if Captain Nemo had discharged it into the conductor the whole force of the current. It might truly be said that between his assailants and himself he had stretched a network of electricity which none could pass with impunity. Meanwhile, the exasperated Papuans had beaten a retreat paralyzed with terror. As for us, half laughing, we consoled and rubbed the unfortunate Ned Land, who swore like one possessed. But at this moment the Nautilus, raised by the last waves of the tide, quitted her coral bed exactly at the 40th minute fixed by the captain. Her screw swept the waters slowly and majestically. Her speed increased gradually, and, sailing on the surface of the ocean, she quitted safe and sound the dangerous passes of the Straits of Torres. Chapter 22 is called Agrysomnia. Let me just scroll and see if it's if it's as long as that last chapter. I don't think we can do it. I think this one's going to go on for a while. So, unfortunately, that is where we're going to call it for tonight. That was quite an episode with the Papuans that were aggressively assaulting the Nautilus, but Captain Nemo had something up his sleeve that, of course, he didn't tell anybody about. So here we are, chapter 22, Acri Somnia. The first word is the, and we will read that tomorrow. I hope you are enjoying the story. I think Kimmy's got some more picture to show us. Here we go. Alrighty then. So I hope everybody has a great evening. I hope you are enjoying the story, and I do want to wait just for a minute because I know the live stream is a little slower, or it's a little bit behind. It's not slower, but so anyway, I will wait just a minute, and now I think it's probably been a long enough time. And I hope you have a good night. God bless you, and we'll see you again next time when we get to read another chapter from 20,000 Leagues Under the